Good afternoon. My name is Doris Meissner. I'm a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C., where I direct our work on U.S. immigration issues. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today, which we're calling Mission Critical, the Evolution of U.S. Homeland Security in the 21st Century. We're going to start with a housekeeping note, which is that if you have any technical problems, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call 202-266-1929. We're going to have a Q&A in the second part of this call. This will not be a voice Q&A. So please type any questions that you'll have into the Q&A or the chat box, or email it to events@migrationpolicy.org. Of course, you can also tweet your questions, and that is to @migrationpolicy or #MPI discuss. We're also going to put a slide up. You see a slide up right now that has some additional resources, recent MPI work that has to do with DHS, the transition, etc. And so please feel free to take note of those, as well as check our website, www.migrationpolicy.org. So let me start off by saying that our discussion today, the focal point for our discussion today, is a recently published book that's entitled Beyond 9/11, Homeland Security for the 21st Century. It's a book that has been co-edited by Alan Gerson, Juliette Kayyem, and Chappell Lawson, two of those people who are with us today as speakers in this webinar. So let me introduce our presenters who bring a wealth of experience and knowledge to the issues that we'll be discussing today. In alphabetical order, Alan Cohn, who is a former Assistant Secretary for Strategy, Planning and Analysis and Risk at DHS, is currently with STEPTO. Juliette Kayyem, who was Assistant Secretary, Intergovernmental Affairs at DHS, now at the Kennedy School, and a co-editor of the book. Chappell Lawson, former Executive Director and Special Advisor to the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, now at MIT, also a co-editor of the book. And Christian Marrone, former Chief of Staff at DHS, now with Lockheed Martin. So before I start asking them questions and they start talking to you and with each other, let me just give a few comments here that set the scene. So DHS, Department of Homeland Security, is the newest cabinet agency in our government. It's now 17 years old. It has a wide range of responsibilities that we'll hear about. But immigration is the single largest area of its responsibility, at least measuring by resources and by personnel. Both categories represent close to half of DHS's people and funding. DHS has in recent years been the focal point of some of the administration's most controversial and highly visible policies and actions. To name a few: building the wall, family separation, sending federal law enforcement personnel to large cities in response to demonstrations. It's also an agency that has, in the recent period, experienced very rapid turnover at the leadership ranks, and we've seen increasing numbers of acting appointees. Some of those acting appointees have been found to be unlawfully in their jobs, which throws into question the policy actions and directives that they may have issued. That was made very clear this weekend with a judgment by a district court about the DACA program, and the DACA program having been improperly changed after a Supreme Court decision by the current acting secretary. So it's against this recent backdrop that today we want to take a bit of a deeper dive into understanding more fully DHS as an institution, and then its immigration responsibilities and roles, how those have been carried out. So with that, let me begin by asking a question first to Christian Marrone. Christian, can you give us the backdrop here. Talk to us about the broad rationale for the creation of DHS. How close did that rationale then come to the actual design that Congress put into place?
Thank you, Doris, and it's a pleasure to be here, especially with my co-authors. And Alan and I, we wrote the first or second chapter of the book. And I'm also here in my personal capacity. Now I don't represent Lockheed Martin in this forum. But you ask a really good question. So the original idea obviously was born out of 9/11, and it was a security threat event. It was a terrorist event. And the need to kind of get a better handle on an integrated approach to security of the homeland, whether it be immigration, whether it be terrorist threats, who's coming in, who's leaving the country, and have a broader understanding of that. Wrapped into that was some kind of a little bit of outliers like the Coast Guard, who never really truly had a home. And then you had the Secret Service, who really didn't like their home at Treasury, and I don't think they like their home at Homeland these days. But the common thread amongst all of it was security and screening and vetting of individuals, and I think that was certainly the idea behind the formation of it. Over time, issues like immigration, at least when it was founded, weren't kind of front and center. It was always about first and foremost counterterrorism, and I think we've seen over the last, I'd say, 6 years, the dynamics of immigration changing have changed the dynamics of the department. And I think it all goes back to the way in which the department was structured. Probably wasn't the right structure in terms of you had these 7 different components that were set up, all had different cultures. Some of them were from other places that were merged together, like CBP and whatnot. Others were created out of whole cloth. And I think one of the things that was heavily, may have been heavily discounted at first was culture, but more importantly, the overarching structure that sat on top of it. And I think that's where I think if we've looked, an area where the biggest concern has been that overarching structure, because the issues of the day it's kind of the dog, it's the tail wagging the dog, if you will. That front office, that office of the secretary, which comprises of the headquarters structure, really has been chasing one crisis after another, and never really had an opportunity to kind of settle in, build kind of a custom and practice in terms of how things are to operate. So as a result, you get different levels of operation sophistication depending on who the secretary is. And certainly the secretary then, depending on what pressures they're getting from Congress or the White House, will have different pushes and pulls on the system. I'd say though that that overarching structure needs to be holistically fixed. I think over time, that is something that Congress needs to take a close look at in terms of how that reorganizes. I also think that this, when you talk about operating the department, while it is an operational component, it's very stovepiped in its operations, and not a lot of thought was really given. And I get it, when they were first putting it together, it was coming at them fast and furious, and we didn't know what threat was coming from where. And Governor Ridge and his team did a great job of just cobbling it together. But after that initial cobbling, was never really put together in terms of how it should operate, like you see at the Department of Defense or other departments, where there is a common, where they come together and operate together, where the secretary has the full authority to bring all his different pieces together against a common threat. And so I think as we move forward with DHS, those are some of the things that I think really need to change. I also believe that there's too many political appointees in the overarching structure, and that accounts for a lot of the wavering back and forth, and the department gets yin-yanged around in many respects politically, and perhaps with a more professional cadre in there, that would help change the dynamic. But the original purpose, I think, still stands today. All the components that are there should continue to be there. Do you maybe add or subtract one or two here and there? Possibly. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, but I think the overarching idea behind the Department of Homeland Security still stands today. And with the right group with the right focus, I think it can operate high. It can be very highly effective. And I think it's important, again, to note it's only 17 years old. And in the life of a Washington bureaucracy, it is still a child. It is still a child and acts like a child and talks like a child, etc. And I think, we have to, I know coming from DOD going to DHS, it was quite the culture shock for me, just in terms of what we didn't do versus what DOD did. But we'd always have to remind ourselves and remind others, one, we're not DOD. Okay, we have a different mission. We have a different makeup. We're essentially a law enforcement organization. But two, we haven't been around for 60 years. We haven't had a Goldwater Nichols. We haven't gone through a lot of what they've gone through yet because we're still young. So I just would caution everybody to give DHS a chance, but we got to get our act together soon, because in order for it to really move forward as an effective instrument of our government, we got to take a lot of the we got to keep it central. We got to keep it in a kind of on a central path, because right now we've gone too far one way and then too far the other, and we got to get it back to the middle where it needs to be. Our vision always for DHS was to be beyond the political, much like DOD, and not get dragged into the political fights of the day. We're a national security agency, and I think we got to get back to that. That's really where we need to be, and it starts really with a secretary and a deputy and an organizing structure around them, and then obviously getting those components to work together as one team, one DHS. I know that's a kind of we've had different slogans throughout the year, throughout its history. Unified, the one that Al and I had started, and I think we had done pretty good up until a certain point. But there's different efforts, but we got to just fixate on one, get it set, and then move forward and start laying cement on it. So I think that's a long answer to your short question, Doris.
Well, you raised a lot of great points. So there are, really important things here to pick up on. Let me go to you, Juliette, and pick up on the 17-year-old. We have a 17-year-old here. So
I actually do have one, so I'm really good at this.
Right. That's what I was thinking. So, we have a 17-year-old, and against the things that Christian has talked about, what do you think have been the most important accomplishments, and where would you place the weaknesses?
Yeah.
In terms of what Christian has said here, and how does immigration fit within that in terms of its performance?
Okay, so that's a good question. So, okay, I hope this doesn't come off the wrong way. I think one of the best moments, I'm looking at 17 years now, or one of the most important moments that is often forgotten about the department is the post-Katrina department course correction. So those of us who've been in Homeland Security a long time know 2001 to 2005, it had a very preventative, sort of left of boom focus. And terrorism. That was like basically it. 2005 was an important course correction, happened under Chertoff and the second part of the Bush administration, or the second term of the Bush administration, which was it really did adopt what had already been known in the field, which is the best approach is an all hazards one, is one in which it's taking into account cyber and natural disasters and pandemics, obviously, and of course, terrorism. So I think that that's an important, remember, because we have to get back to that. So if you ask me sort of what does so this now is going to get to the weakness. So if you ask me sort of, what does the department need to do? In some ways, it needs a second course correction. That for the last 4 years, it is, people say it's been focused on immigration. That's not true. It's been focused on border enforcement, a small piece of immigration, right? I mean, it's been literally, its resources have been focused on essentially some, border controls rather than thinking through a 21st century immigration policy, which which we all sort of, I think, know what the broad contours of that are. So when I think about its weaknesses now, this probably gets to my sweet spot, which is, we've had a department, and this was true in the early years too, when, but less sort of violent, I would say, when the department would have like an edict, like, oh, states and localities spend, 25% of your Homeland Security funds on X. And, half the states and jurisdictions would say, you've got to be kidding me. Like, we don't have that threat, or, that we have to have a much more nuanced approach to threat assessments in the homeland. So this is a department, and picking up on Christian, you can call it politics, you can just call it a certain kind of politics, a certain person in the White House guiding this kind of politics, but that has gone to war with its constituency and its, state and locals, and territorial and tribal, whether it's on response in Puerto Rico, or the COVID, going to war with governors when all they really needed was the Defense Production Act to be invoked, and for FEMA to get a handle on the logistics supply chain. They weren't asking, the federal government for, hospital capacity, not at least at this stage, though we may come to that. Or it's the use of HSI, during, what are, by any fair accounting, predominantly lawful protests in various US cities. So in terms of its worst moments, I could give you a bunch of policies and child separation. I mean, the list for me, for someone like me, is long. I don't need, the Muslim ban, you name it, I got it, right? But if you ask sort of what's the overall strategy that has been the most, the one that needs to be remedied very quickly, it's a department that recognizes its stakeholders is not DC. It's the state, local, territorial, and tribal governments, along with the American citizen, the NGOs, the private sector, the enterprise, as we call it, that are its constituency. And any agency that goes to war against its constituencies is going to find its work more difficult and less successful.
Juliette, I'm going to go, I want to pick up on a couple of those points, but I want to go to Chap because he has to break off. He's teaching this afternoon. Chap, before you need to leave us, can you talk a little bit further about this issue of that Juliette has raised to some extent about implementing more fully immigration? The Biden administration has a very broad agenda for what it wants to do on immigration. From your standpoint and your experience, how well positioned is DHS today to actually be implementing that broader kind of an immigration agenda?
I think that's a great question. So first of all, thank you very much to Doris and to MPI as a whole for hosting us. She's too modest to acknowledge it, but she also was a chapter writer in our book, along with Andrew Seeley and Amy Pope, wrote the chapter on immigration policy. And especially thank you, Doris, for allowing me to hop in and then hop off early to teach my undergraduates at MIT. With respect to your question, so Christian wants us to put aside childish things, bureaucratically speaking, and I think he's absolutely right. But there is a corollary to that, which is that, one, we shouldn't be driven as the department too much by the immigration agenda. There are many other agendas in the department that have gotten short shrift as so much attention has been focused on this mission. As you said, of course, it's one of the main missions of the department, but it's not the only one. And I think we need to return to normalcy and balance under the Biden administration. That applies, I think, as well to the scope of the agenda. I also think it's important that we put aside childish things when it comes to partisan politics. I mean, the pretense of Homeland Security is that this is a public good. This is a department that, above all, should serve the whole of the people. And most of the things the department does, most of the time, don't really have a strong partisan tilt to it. And we need to remember that. So when it comes time for the president-elect and his team to take over, I think rather than a clear cut, here we need to preserve actually some of the things that the Trump administration has done, while ditching entirely all the gratuitous cruelty that went along with the policies of this administration. So we have let 10% of the population on one extreme drive immigration policy for the last 4 years. I don't think we want 10% of the population on the other extreme to drive immigration policy now. So I'm hoping, praying, sacrificing small animals, whatever it is, that we don't move in a direction of inadvertently saying things that will trigger a humanitarian crisis at the border by giving people the impression that now asylums are a free-for-all again, that now anyone who wants to get in will likely be paroled into the country and then assigned a court date at some distant point in the future. And I think if it's people on this Zoom event, or Ali Mayorkas or Amy Pope or whoever it is running the show, we will not have this problem. But I think if we allow immigration policy too much to be set by some of the advocacy groups, or maybe too much in the White House and not enough through DHS itself, we could get ourselves into that danger. So my biggest plea to everybody, besides don't reorganize the bureaucracy further, my second biggest plea is not to put aside everything that the Trump administration has done and view it as evil. And I'll just give two examples before I hop off. And the first is the National Vetting Center. When Donald Trump first floated this idea as a campaign talking point, I thought, what a ridiculous thing he's saying. We've been doing vetting since 9/11. We've been doing it really well. Bad people don't get into the country. And this is nothing more than a political gesture. But they've actually created something real. And I don't think we want to ditch it. And then on the asylum side, I think the definition of the grounds for an asylum gradually expanded, I think, well beyond what the original legislative intent probably was, and for all sorts of good reasons and noble reasons. But there is danger with such a capacious definition of what constitutes grounds for an asylum. And we want to have a balance between the way the Trump administration has done it and something between what was done before and the way it could be done without the unnecessary cruelty. So those are my pleas for the next administration. And thank you again very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's and drop off whenever it's convenient for you, Chap. We'll go to Alan now. Alan, this issue of the border that Chap was talking about, the point that Christian made at the beginning about the core rationale still stands, national security. But the national security lens tends to be, just by the nature of national security, a very focused, high standard, really, and lots of things are now being fit into that national security lens. So I wonder whether you could talk to us, just as a policy matter, definitional matter, how do you understand to be the national security responsibilities that have to do with immigration, or beyond that, the other missions in DHS, as compared with ongoing law enforcement responsibilities, ongoing responsibilities of many sorts? Have we stretched the notion of national security much too broadly, or does national security in today's world actually need to be stretched more broadly? How should we understand all of that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And thank you, Doris, and to MPI for hosting us. And it was really great to be able, first, to work with everyone on this panel, except Doris, to my regret, while I was at DHS, and also to write with Christian what we thought was an approach to, an effective approach to managing and governing the department and its mission set. So I had the privilege of serving in the department under both the George W. Bush and the Obama administrations as a career official. And so I got to see different approaches from, as Juliette described, that immediate post-Katrina period when I started, through kind of a set of different challenges across the department's mission responsibilities, until I left in 2015. And I have to say that the issue that you put your finger on, it's truly a real issue. Immigration is one of those threads that runs through national security, and national security is one of those threads that runs through immigration. But it's also one of the most politically charged areas, in the political landscape over the last 20 years. And it results in a highly politically charged area at DHS, which tries, and I think has largely succeeded, as Christian pointed out, to be an apolitical department in pretty much all of its other mission sets. So when we think about immigration and the national security related aspects of immigration, obviously we think of customs and border protection and immigration and customs enforcement and their roles in border management, in interior immigration enforcement, in national security investigations. We think about US Citizenship and Immigration Services and its national security branch, guarding against fraud and exploitation of the lawful immigration system. We might sometimes forget about the Coast Guard's role in interdicting migrants at sea and mass migration episodes. And obviously, when we think about national security, we think about the 9/11 hijackers. They're exploiting the visa system, the lawful immigration system. But historically, immigration agents were often used in national security, espionage investigations. And immigration authorities were used as the basis to arrest and detain and even deport espionage suspects because the immigration violations were easier to substantiate than the espionage ones. And so likewise, when we think about Homeland Security, the immigration-related authorities run through CBP and ICE and Coast Guard activities in particular aimed at criminal and national security investigations, enforcement, removal operations, migrant operations at sea, et cetera. So they're pretty clearly there, but of course, there's other border and immigration related activities of the department. And indeed, the department has a range of border management and immigration administration responsibilities that are proactive, that have to do with the facilitation of people and goods entering the country. And it creates a real tension for both DHS leadership in addressing those issues and in questions about DHS governance. And so I think that what we have to think about when we think about immigration, national security, Homeland Security, and DHS is, look at the stress that we place on the department in terms of defining immigration priorities for itself in the context of broader national immigration priorities. Obviously, the department focused on security, risk mitigation, but across a range of different issues, not just kind of hard counterterrorism issues. When we think about how much of that national responsibility for immigration writ large rests with DHS, there's a lot of interrelationship with other departments and agencies like the Department of Justice and its immigration judges and prosecutors, or the Department of Health and Human Services and its responsibilities for unaccompanied minors and related issues. And that leads us to a really difficult question that has vexed kind of administration after administration, which is it good for national or Homeland Security that the Secretary of Homeland Security often becomes the point person and thus the lightning rod for immigration reform or specific elements of immigration policy like DACA? We can look at just the past few weeks and the central role that DHS has been playing in disaster response through FEMA and in election integrity through CISA, its newest operating entity. And the tension between that and just the overwhelming focus and political focus that immigration brings on the department. And remember, this is not new to the Trump administration. This happened both with respect to the failed effort to pass immigration reform in the George W. Bush administration, and also in the various immigration-related initiatives of the Obama administration. And so I think, and I think Doris, you made mention of this, the question, the last question really is kind of, do we run the danger that immigration issues overwhelm the attention of DHS headquarters and the DHS secretary to the detriment of other national risks that the Department of Homeland Security is really charged to manage, both through its immigration-related entities, CBP, ICE, USCIS, the Coast Guard, and through its other operating entities. On the other hand, does removing the DHS secretary from the loop in kind of decision-making around immigration, is that detrimental to DHS's ability to utilize the national security-related immigration authorities and the basic tools that we have for border management, immigration administration, and others? So, you know, I wish there were more answers than questions, but I think those are some really important questions that are going to face this administration coming in, as they have faced administrations before now.
And Doris, let me just add, I think it just goes back to, you got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, and you got to be able to handle, because of the breadth of the issues that the department has and the missions, it all, to me, it all comes back to, how do you structure that in a way that you can do multiple things at any given time? And all too often, in my experience, it was always the secretary was the final decision maker, or had to be the ultimate action officer on whether it was Ebola, immigration, you know, failings at the time of the Secret Service or TSA, you know, whether it was some counterterrorism threats that we were getting. I mean, everything kind of begins and ends with the secretary, and he did not, you know, in our structure, the way you did not have enough others who can kind of work those issues while you're maybe working another issue. And I think it really does come down to how we structured that overarching headquarters, because that to me means everything. In DOD, you have the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which is rather large for a good purpose, because you're managing this large institution with all these different, you know, issues that they're dealing with, and all kinds of things that are going on in the Department of Defense. And they managed to do it. We don't have a similar structure in DHS. And I would also add, you know, we don't have a similar structure in our oversight with Congress, which also hamper your ability as well. So, you know, we've given the leaders of DHS a very poor infrastructure, of, you know, a very poor kind of board of governors, if you will, in Congress, because it's so disparate, and there's so many people who have a say in what you do, in your budget, and et cetera. Yet we expect that secretary to essentially do all these things with a small staff, and to kind of get it all done and never have an issue. And I think that's the fallacy to me in the way the Department of Homeland Security was initially set up and now has evolved. And we haven't accounted for all these different things that happen in the way in which we operate on a daily basis in our structure, and then also in our oversight.
Can I just add something to that? Because I do think, like, we haven't, so obviously immigration and fixing immigration and figuring out its priority. We've got a pandemic of which I mean, this is those of us who've been in DHS is like, where the heck is DHS? Like, I mean, this is the biggest Homeland Security issue. I'm not laughing. I'm laughing because I'm crying, you know, in terms of the number of people who, 400,000. I said 400,000 publicly in April, and I sort of regretted that I said it just because I saw what was going on. And now 400,000, like, if we're lucky, dead. And okay, so we have no real role. I haven't seen the secretary really involved with it. Doesn't seem to be part of the. Meanwhile, this is our disaster management agency. You have climate change and now we can say climate change, but you have the other pressures on the department coming out of the worst. No reason to believe it will be the worst for any longer than a year, the worst hurricane season, and then the droughts and the fires. I mean, it will just be consistent through the calendar. But I want to add one more to the mix that we really haven't got our head around, because I'll be careful. I mean, no, I'm not going to be, because of the temperature about how we talk to one another and how we communicate disagreement. Is the department does not have a good capacity because of the politics on, where does the hate go, people? Like, I mean, the rise of white supremacy under this administration, we saw it certainly during Obama. I've been thinking about it a lot. Like I'm a big believer that when it's not coddled, nurtured, and shamed from the top, a lot of it will go away. Doesn't mean those people don't have feelings that we wish they didn't have. I just don't think its threat is as strong. So we'll see in the next year or two whether, the absence of sort of, radicalizing force in the White House will dissipate. But we've got, you know, the department does not have a good handle outside of what the FBI is doing about how to think about what to do with the hate. And I'm emboldened by how small some of the protests are for in this period, that you haven't seen the kind of civic unrest that mayors were worried about. I certainly know because I train a lot of them through the Bloomberg Mayors Program, and what we're preparing for. You saw the National Guard on standby in about half of the states. I mean, people were really nervous, and the fact that that didn't happen is good. But I just wanted to add that into the mix because it is the terror threat that I talked about at the beginning has obviously changed, and it's just different because it does not have the border issue that, I mean, it's ours, unfortunately, it's ours.
Julia, you
And
raised
I'll
a
add
great
one more point.
because
Yeah.
that was an office that was set up countering violent extremism, initially born out of the growth of ISIS and the idea that people were self-radicalizing in their basement, which was true. We were going out to meet with those different communities. We also knew that there was a domestic counterterrorism threat. You can color it a lot of different ways. It's bipartisan. And what was really kind of depressing in many respects to me was having worked so hard to get that office up and running, and we put a grant program in place, that it was essentially dismantled not long after because it was looked at as a partisan issue, when in fact it isn't. It's something that's critically important. We know where these people are. We know because our mission follows us in the state and local. We're very much the federal partner to state and local, and we've kind of let that one go. But it just underscores again, Doris, the vastness of the mission. You got to be able to have the structure to handle it, and we've kind of let that go. And much to, I think, to what we see today and what we saw over the summer. I mean, it's something that the department should be engaged in.
Yeah. And I would add one other point, which is this dimension of time, which is something that the Defense Department has been able to articulate. You see people like Robert Gates articulate, and Christian made mention of it, which is that, especially in immigration, you can see there's an intense amount of policymaking that goes on at DHS and around DHS about what do we do today. But the other thing that the Secretary of Homeland Security, that the decision-making kind of governance bodies of the department, the leadership of its operational components and its headquarters entities need to be thinking about building what the department's going to need tomorrow. And whether that's an office an office viewing a new or emerging threat, to the fact that kind of the long-range air patrol capability of both the Coast Guard and Customs and Border Protection is reaching the end of its useful life, and what's going to replace that? And should we do that together, you know, multiple entities within the department doing joint procurement, joint acquisitions, and even, you know, looking at something like what happened in Portland and, you know, kind of the double tragedy of the fact that the department used its special operations entities improperly, as the DHS Inspector General concluded. But it was an example of the department actually combining some of its special operations units in a common way to support the mission, ostensibly, of one of the other operating components, which is something the department should be doing with the proper rules of engagement, with the proper operational command and plans and chains of command. So this dimension of time is also there, which is that the department, the walking and chewing gum also has to be about being able to make and execute policy today, but also build the capabilities and the activities for the department that it will need tomorrow and the next day and the next day.
Let me, we're starting to get questions in on the chat box, and I want to say some things about the Q&A and then come back to a couple of these points that you've raised, because you've actually answered some of the things that people are asking about. But let me just say that, you know, the floor is open for questions. And so please type your questions into the chat box or email them to events@migrationpolicy.org. You can also tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or #MPI discuss. I'm going to there's been a question already about the point you raised, Juliette, on white supremacy as a new threat, pandemics as new threats, etc. And there's also been a question about that goes to the culture point that you made earlier, Christian, that has to do with particularly asylum and the way in which the asylum process has been basically shut down at the southwest border. The issue is, what do you do about that when you have a federal agency that actually is violating, or at least there's a case to be made that it's violating the laws of the land?
Well, I'll just say, you expect Congress to hold them accountable, and regardless of whoever the president is, Congress has enough wherewithal. They got to be held accountable. So if they're not doing their job and they're not enforcing the law, or just kind of abdicating their responsibilities there, I think Congress has the ultimate authority through the purse string, but also through oversight and all. So surprised that a little bit about how that kind of maybe didn't occur as effective as it could have. I will also say, though, that the idea that USCIS is funded primarily, it was funded almost entirely through fees, is another fallacy that I think we need to work through. That they do need additional appropriations beyond just the fees that they take, because they do need more personnel. And the asylum issue is, they're not new in the sense of, you have a lot of folks, given what's been happening in Central America, who've been applying for asylum, who tried to come to this country. And even in the previous administration I was there, we simply did not have enough people to do the processing, to do the real work. And that has nothing to do with anything other than not having, kind of enough people. And then you become limited because your budget, they only raise so much money every year through fees. And so they're limited in terms of what their budget can do. So I think, one of the things that I really truly believe is that USCIS needs to move away from, and I think it would help with their oversight as well, needs to move away from just being fee funded, much like CBP. They're not just fee funded. They get a lot of money through the appropriations process. I think we have to look at that for USCIS. One, to give them Congress better oversight and more of a touch in terms of what they're doing. But two, let's be realistic. If there's more people coming, we got to be able to account for that and deal with that. And we haven't been able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Juliette, did you want to add to that?
No, I mean, look, there's going to be a fix-it phase in terms of, the rightful enforcement or the lawful enforcement of the laws that should be obeyed. There's going to be a quantitative phase in which you're going to increase the numbers of people that could come in through various different programs, asylum, refugee. But I do, so there's both of those phases. I think those are relatively quick. I mean, I think, in other words, when you think about, if you're worried, and I'm looking at one of the questions, if you're worried about sort of how do you fix it, one of the good things about executive actions that were, promoted by Stephen Miller, everyone knows what I mean by that, is that they get repealed by executive action. There is almost no legislation out there that I'm particularly worried about. I mean, it's just not. I mean, the legislative initiative for the department is going to be whether we have a domestic terrorism law, things like, and of course, DACA. Because we would like to get a legislative fix for the Dreamers. But almost everything is, maybe if not day one, is at least, able to be implemented over the first 100 days. So that makes me happy in a good way. But I want to pick up on what Chap said, because I think it is important for, for those of us who are on the security or the enforcement side of some of this stuff, that we also need to ensure that we can actually enforce those laws, that we have, that we do not create a magnet for activity that is dangerous to those who might think that it's a brand new day and everything's open, because it is dangerous to those individuals. It is dangerous for their children. And it is, of course, a heartache for us. So, the department is invested in ensuring that it has enforcement, not, there's good and bad enforcement, humane and inhumane enforcement, but not simply because we're a bad agency. We know what you say, a lot of you say about the agency, we get it, abolish ICE, abolish DHS, but because as we all know, people go to great dangers if they believe erroneously in a certain policy that is actually not reality. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we course correct or right size some of these really inhumane executive orders that can be turned over relatively quickly. That makes me happy.
Let me pick up on this issue that you've both raised, Christian and Juliette, about asylum and the way in which the asylum process is not properly staffed, but also can function as a magnet. And the functioning as a magnet has to do with the long periods of time that it takes to reach an asylum decision, which is ultimately, at this point, given the way the things operate, a function of the immigration courts, which is in the Justice Department, and which operates through different budget process, under a different leadership structure, etc. Should if one could wave a magic wand, should EOR no longer be in the Justice Department? Should this be a function? Should the immigration courts function be a function that is in the same leadership structure as the adjudicatory processes that lead to it?
I completely endorse that idea. The most frustrating thing that we had to deal with was when we were dealing with large spikes that we couldn't get the Department of Justice. It relies on a lot of cooperation, a lot of interagency. Then you start to get too many, cooks in the kitchen. And it would really be good if we can build in a system that is trustworthy, has some integrity to it, that the Department of Homeland Security would have that, kind of. And so then when you look the budget, because we don't do this, and this to me is one of the serial problems we have. We tried to do this, and Alan was one of the architects of it, but we don't budget for immigration. We budget CBP, ICE. We budget, everybody budgets in their stovepipes, and it all kind of comes up together. We tried to do more holistic, but the only way you get to those root causes, Doris, is because in this town money talks and what walks. You got to do it together. It's got to be integrated, and you got to have one common approach. And here you're missing a key aspect of that approach under another department. Like you said, another budget process, another set of appropriators, another set of authorizers. And, as a result, what do? You get a big disconnect, and one creates a problem for the other, and vice versa. So if you don't have enough people doing the processing, and the court system isn't working, well, you can have one, but if you don't have the other, it doesn't, you still have the same problem. And so just go back to, we got to fundamentally rethink the way in which we do a lot of these basic blocking and tackling things that other departments and agencies that are now older, have been functioning a long time, have worked through and figured out. And we need to get to that point. But it requires some serious leadership to do that, and wherewithal. And sometimes asking for help is not a bad thing from others who have done it. And so I think this new secretary, whoever the new secretary is, and the deputy and the team that comes along, if they're going to be focused just on policy issues, we will have swung and missed. We have to get back to the basics of how the department operates in terms of every aspect, including its budget. That is so fundamental. Because it sets off a whole range of things, and you end up seeing the result that you get because of the lack of cohesion and the brokenness as a result. So I just can't underscore that enough.
I'd add one other point, which is that EOR is one issue, but of course, the flip on the other side, the State Department retained the consular affairs in the creation of DHS, and across every mission set at the department, there's some entity, agency, sub-agency in another cabinet department, in another agency that has a direct impact on Homeland Security operations. And so, as Christian said, the new leadership team of the department needs to be, and in my experience, it functions best when you have a secretary who's a chief policy officer, kind of a chief policy officer and leads the department, and a deputy secretary who's kind of a chief management officer who runs who kind of focuses on these management issues, and then uses people like an undersecretary for policy or an undersecretary for management to assist with that. But going up and picking up on another point that Christian mentioned, if you look at OMB, its desk officers are stovepiped by agencies, not by subject area. And if you go up to the appropriations committees, their professional staff members tend to be stovepiped by entity or agency, not by mission area. And so really looking at how can we look more holistically within the department, at the OMB level, at the appropriations level. I mean, there needs to be kind of something of a wholesale re-looking at the way that we conceptualize missions and functions in this space. Immigration is a great example of that, but there are a lot of others that impact the department very heavily, and that hamper department effectiveness because of this reliance on other departments and agencies and other stovepipes and staff.
Well, talking about other agencies and the way these are spread across agencies, we have quite a few questions about refugee issues, asylum issues that go to culture, that go to a national security mindset. Should some of those humanitarian functions, in fact, be relocated in HHS as compared to DHS? In other words, fragmenting further.
So I have strong opinions about which is we have to separate, because this is true of immigration enforcement, border enforcement, let's just be honest here, like all the sort of kind of crappy stuff that the department actually has to do sometimes, because there are limits and rules and standards that are often can seem not fair. That's why we have judges to determine whether the fairness is that case. But the no to the asylum seeker does not go away because you move it to HHS, right? I mean, in other words, someone is going to be enforcing these rules. I'm of the school that you probably do want an immigration enforcement docket or capacity at the department, which includes the good, in the sense like, let's bring people in who are asylum seekers, refugees, whatever, and also the bad, right? The tough stuff that ICE has to do with customs enforcement. Yikes. But that is weird. Sorry, I'm gonna put on my headsets. But anyway, just to remember, this has to get done by someone, and that someone is someone, right? It doesn't make it better that it's at HHS. And so sometimes I think we get the abolish ICE movement that, people like me, like I get criticisms from progressives and stuff, answer the question, who's going to do, and you can't deny there has to be interior enforcement. You may not like this ICE, someone has to do it, presumably, right? Once you actually think about the fact that you do need some sort of interior enforcement mechanism. Just because you put it at a nicer seeming agency does not make it less not nice. I just say that as people, we're in a much better place with this new administration, I think, in terms of this stuff, but some of this stuff is just hard. And yeah, that's my cautionary tale. But anyway, Christian, if you're nodding, I'm nervous, but something fell in the house. So let me go see what that is. I'll be right back.
These are not easy missions, we know that. But let me go back to your point, Christian, because so many of our questions go to policy issues. I mean, should there be TPS? What about what kinds of regulations should be changed? for this population, and how do you withdraw regulations and so forth. Those are all issues that have to do with the department, but they don't go to the structure of the department and to the mission of the department. They go to the way in which those missions are implemented and the choices and decisions that are made about those topics, depending on what the point of view is of an administration. So taking then the point as a point of departure that there is a different point of view that is coming in with the Biden administration. There will be a different set of priorities driven by a different set of assumptions about immigration. You raised the point earlier, Christian, that the original shaping of the Department of Homeland Security brought together a whole set of cultures. And these questions really do go to the culture, which is an important part of any agency. What have you seen over the course of the 17 years in the process of, or in beginning to meld those cultures? How would you describe the culture today? Is it one culture, a national security culture, or is it, as has been said by the Atlantic Council and others, a culture of cultures? When you have a large entity like the Department of Homeland Security, and where, you know, how does a new administration begin to bring its policies into place? Are they structural issues fundamentally, or are they ultimately leadership and policy questions that can be carried out in the current structure, granting what you said, Christian, that there needs to be stronger oversight and resources at the top of DHS as an agency?
Well, you just that is the $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
That is the penultimate question for DHS. So it is a culture of cultures. You have a strong law enforcement culture. You have a strong, I think, a very healthy pro-immigration culture. There's a lot of forms of immigration that are not controversial. We tend to forget that. And USCIS, I mean, just to witness some of those ceremonies where we're bringing in new citizens and all, it is one of the most uplifting things you can do if you're an employee at DHS. And then you actually have the military structure too. You have military culture. I mean, the Coast Guard brings that to the table, which I think is a healthy piece too. So look, the bottom line is what all these different cultures, you're never gonna have one culture in DHS. That's never gonna be the case, because everybody has different missions. I mean, the FEMA mission is a first responder culture. It's completely different in law enforcement in many respects. What you need though is a strong, coming from the top down, strong signal as to here is what we are going to do, and here's how we're going to do it, and here are the expectations that are clearly laid out. And I think that sometimes that sounds very simplistic and it sounds very easy, but it really takes sustained leadership over a period of time and a period of administrations. And so it really starts from the president on down in terms of the direction he gives his Secretary of Homeland Security. And it's really the secretary's job is to drive that overarching, make people understand why they are a part of this department, what role they have, and how they're to do it humanely as possible, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, it really is, you gotta have really good people. This is a very complex, organization, as we've outlined. You got to have very strong leadership that drills that down day in and day out. You may not like every single policy that we bring forward, but if you have someone who's willing to tell folks what it is with clear, very clear guidelines, this is what we're going to do. I think that goes a long way. I mean, I saw Secretary Johnson tell folks in ICE, we sat down with them, who were, very pro law enforcement, want to get out there, want to do the job, want to accomplish the mission. And, sat there and told them, look, you're not going to go after these people. We're going to go after these people. And here's why. And it articulated to them. Some of them may not have liked it at the end of the day, but they went out and did it and executed it. And executed professionally and responsibly. And I think that a lot of that is just, to me, a lot of basic kind of the basic blocking and tackling we miss in this organization. And so it's just about that fundamental, got to communicate. That secretary, whoever he or she is, that has got to be their number one job, to be, kind of in there every day explaining to people. Never take for granted that everybody is on the same page. And that takes a lot. And you need a deputy. That's why I go back to, you need a broader set of people other than, can't just be relying on one person. Now that one person has to really kind of be the head coach there, but you got to have a team of assistants who can carry out, with each one of their teams and bring that together. And that's hard. That's hard stuff. I mean, but that's what we need in leadership. This isn't about, I know immigration well, and therefore I can. You got to be so much more of a dynamic leader than just a policy person, in my view. You really got to understand people and understand what you're dealing with in terms of the cultures. So it's not a simple answer. There's no simple answer to this. Now you can make it easier doing other things like I talked about, but at the end of the day, if you don't have that right at the top, I can point to a million different examples in our government where you have it and you don't. But I really think the signal starts, whoever's in the White House, and that kind of clear guidance down. Take the mystery out of it. Let the folks know what they're expected, and let them go out and do it.
So we're nearing the end of our time. Alan or Juliette, would you like to add any to those comments?
No, I forgot to do at the beginning what I want to do now, which is to thank you, Doris and MPI. I forgot you had, I said to someone, two things about editing a volume. One is it's hard, and two is it's really hard when you release it during a pandemic. So I want to thank you and your team for giving us a platform and for being part of the book. So sorry, I forgot at the beginning, but my bad manners are corrected now. So thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, it's hard to follow Juliette and Christian on pretty much anything, but no, I would just echo what Christian said, that the question of how to make DHS work as well as it can, the question of how to make the immigration function at DHS work as well as it can, is a mixed question of leadership, structure, culture, governance. And the leadership team at the department needs to constantly pay attention to all of that. It's as Christian said, it's a very difficult job. It's like trying to keep a lot of different plates, not only spinning in the air at once, but interlinked with each other, and making sure everybody understands what they're doing. And so no, I'd be hard pressed to add anything to what my colleagues have already said.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, and I am, of course, very grateful to our speakers for being with us today. The questions that you sent in are many. We haven't had an opportunity to answer all of them, for which I apologize. And of course, there are quite a number of issues that we haven't been able to get to at all. There are questions about accountability, about professionalism, about oversight by Congress, the large numbers of committees as compared with other cabinet agencies to which the Department of Homeland Security needs to answer. There are issues of the interagency process, coordinating across agencies, many questions about biometrics and privacy. So the agenda where DHS is concerned is broad. It'll be a matter of continuing discussion, something that MPI will continue to be interested in. But for now, thank you for participating. Again, thanks to our guests, and good afternoon.